Cuba, April 1961. A botched attempt to overthrow Fidel Castro becomes an American foreign policy nightmare. The Bay of Pigs fiasco. 18 months later, the Cuban Missile Crisis. The world has never come so close to full-scale nuclear war as it did during 2 weeks in October 1962. Kennedy, Khrushchev, Castro, and Cuba in this edition of the 20th century. I'm Mike Wallace. The time, January 1961. A new era begins in two world capitals. Capitals of nations that once were friends. One was Washington.
Let every nation know, whether it wishes us well or ill, that we shall pay any price, bear any burden, meet any hardship, support any friend, oppose any foe, to assure the survival and the success of liberty.
The other is Havana, where the hero of Cuba's recent revolution is now in power.
Será la victoria, patria o muerte, venceremos.
In 1961, the word charisma was just coming into vogue, for politicians at least. But if the word didn't exist, we probably would have had to invent it to describe these two vigorous young leaders, John F. Kennedy and Fidel Castro. But they were on opposite sides of the Cold War, and Castro, already a thorn in Washington's side, would soon be a catalyst for the Kennedy administration's biggest foreign policy blunder. The invasion of the Bay of Pigs was a catastrophe. 114 anti-Castro Cubans were killed, 1,100 more were captured. Castro remained in power stronger than ever, and the United States and its new president was seen as meddling, bumbling, and weak. It had all begun a few years earlier in the Sierra Maestra Mountains, where Castro and his growing band of guerrillas were gathering strength for their big push to overthrow Cuba's longtime dictator, Fulgencio Batista.
We gladly suffer cold and rain and the hardship of life in the mountains. This is only the beginning. The last battle will be fought in the capital. You can be sure.
This was no idle boast. Victory for the revolution came on New Year's Day, 1959. And in fact, the cheering in the streets of Havana was met with guarded approval in Washington, in the hope that this bearded new leader would be a force for democracy in Cuba. But within months after coming to power, reality overtook optimism, as Castro established his own brand of dictatorship with palpable leanings toward communism. Middle-class liberals in Cuba had formed a key faction in the anti-Batista rebellion, and now they were outraged by Castro's betrayal of their democratic goals. Castro's response to their complaints was swift and decisive. Hundreds of his former allies were hauled before military tribunals, thrown in jail, or executed. Others fled to a life of exile in the United States. In the meantime, Castro had fallen out of favor in Washington. Top-secret discussions of what could be done to embarrass him, to discredit him, were held in the sealed corridors of the CIA. One plan called for spiking Castro's cigars with LSD shortly before he was to give a speech, so that his words would come out all babble and mush. Another plan proposed that his boots be dusted with a special powder that would cause his beard to fall out, thus stripping him of his macho charisma. Some high-ranking U.S. officials believed that Castro merited more than mere embarrassment. One of them was Richard Nixon. When Castro visited Washington in 1959, he met with the vice president. Years later, in a CBS Reports interview with Bill Moyers, Castro recalled that encounter with Nixon.
To listen to me with attention, I think that with indulgence. And then we said goodbye. Later on, I found out that immediately after our interview was over, Nixon sent a memorandum to Eisenhower telling him that I was a communist and that I had to be eliminated.
And in March of 1960, President Eisenhower authorized the CIA to overthrow the Cuban dictator. That decision, it should be said, came at a time when Cold War tensions were sharply escalating. 1960 was the year an American U-2 spy plane was shot down over Russia, and Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev was in a bellicose mood. He not only sabotaged an East-West summit meeting that spring, but he was threatening to force a showdown in Berlin, the vital nerve center in the conflict between Washington and Moscow. The man picked by the White House to orchestrate the plan to get rid of Castro was Richard Bissell, then the CIA's chief of covert operations. In a rare television interview in 1977, Bissell recalled the mood in Washington during those waning months of the Eisenhower administration.
In the year 1960, to contemplate a full-fledged communist state just off our shores in the Caribbean was indeed extremely shocking. Everyone's used to this now. But that was a very shocking concept.
It was Bissell who decided to use Castro's own people, the Cuban exiles who had gathered in Florida, as the instrument to overthrow his regime. CIA operatives were dispatched to recruit the exiles into a secret military training program in Guatemala. As originally conceived, the modest plan called for a clandestine drop of small guerrilla units inside Cuba, where they would proceed to foment an uprising, not unlike the rebellion Castro himself had led in his campaign to oust Batista. But as time went on, it grew into a far more ambitious operation, both in scope and objectives.
Many times when the newspaper has no news, they invent the news.
For his part, Castro was doing his best to alienate mainstream Americans. In September of 1960, he made another trip to the States. This time he came to New York, ostensibly to address the United Nations, but he quickly turned the visit into a propaganda circus. Thumbing his nose at the posh Midtown hotels where heads of state were expected to stay, he checked in at the Hotel Teresa in Harlem, where he proceeded to court black Americans who, in Castro's view, were victims of capitalistic oppression. Khrushchev, too, was in New York that month. In fact, it was at this session of the United Nations that the Soviet premier made a spectacle of himself by pounding his fists to protest a speech that had triggered his disdain. Castro and Khrushchev exchanged hearty bear hugs on the streets of Harlem in an ostentatious display of solidarity between Moscow and Havana. Even by New York standards, their performance seemed excessively theatrical.
President Castro, would you like to meet with President Eisenhower and discuss matters with him?
You ought to ask the President Eisenhower about that.
Castro, would you like to
Needless to say, Castro was an issue in that fall's presidential race. Kennedy won a razor-thin victory that November. But when the confrontation with Castro came the following spring, the new president learned some hard and bitter lessons about the exercise of power. The central promise of the Kennedy campaign had been to get this country moving again. And those first few weeks on the new frontier were marked by vigorous, round-the-clock activity, especially when compared to the deliberate and frequently placid tone of the Eisenhower years. And the exuberant start was producing the desired results. Just 2 months into his presidency, Kennedy's approval rating had soared to 78%. But Eisenhower had left the new president with a ticking time bomb, and it was getting set to go off. The Cuban exiles had been secretly training in Guatemala under the CIA's supervision. One advantage of the plan, which called for a small guerrilla operation, was that it would severely limit the role of the United States. Whether the guerrillas succeeded or failed in their move against Castro, their efforts could not be easily traced to Washington. But Castro was training his own troops, too. CIA intelligence indicated he was in a far stronger position to resist a guerrilla uprising than Batista had been. Having learned from his own triumph, Castro was ready to crush the same kind of rebellion that had swept him into power.
In Cuba tonight, thousands of militiamen are walking sentry duty beside sandbag fortifications. The radio blares martial music. The guns point out to sea. The sea from which the government keeps saying the United States intends to invade any hour now.
The CIA strategists were confident that once a beachhead was established, thousands of anti-Castroites inside Cuba would rise up and join the liberators. The counter-revolution would be underway in full force, and Castro would be overthrown. This was the plan presented to the newly elected President Kennedy by Richard Bissell and his boss, CIA Director Allen Dulles. Kennedy's initial response was negative. Too spectacular, he said. It sounds like D-Day. You have to reduce the noise level of this thing. The top-level meetings carried over into March. Dulles and Bissell argued their case for the invasion, and not a single senior Kennedy advisor spoke out against the invasion. All were new to their jobs, and so they were reluctant to challenge the CIA officials. Kennedy said, okay, but with the strict condition that there would be no intervention by U.S. forces. Whatever happened, he wanted to be in a position to deny, plausibly, any U.S. involvement. Leaders of the brigade would later claim that their CIA contacts had assured them that if the invasion ran into serious trouble, American forces would come to their rescue. Under no circumstances, they were told, would Washington permit the operation to fail. Richard Bissell would later contend that Kennedy did not think the matter through to its logical conclusions.
If everyone had believed and admitted to himself that the U.S. would be wholly held responsible, the president probably would have canceled the operation. But what in fact happened was that we had gone along for the preceding 2 months being over-careful not to have a white face on the beaches, not to have a modern aircraft in the air, and we had been over-careful about these things that could have made a big difference, especially the air crews, because we were trying to preserve disclaimability. We were trying to preserve something that already was lost.
But at the time, Bissell was predicting a victorious outcome, even under Kennedy's conditions. And having received White House approval, he gave the final go-ahead. The target, the Bay of Pigs, the date, April 17th, 1961. The invasion never had a chance. The 1,400-man force had been recruited from middle-class Cubans who had fled to Florida. Doctors, musicians, bankers, lawyers, artists. Fewer than 200 of them were professional soldiers. Some of the latecomers hadn't even learned how to fire a rifle. In the days leading up to the invasion, word began to leak out, first in the Cuban community in Miami and then in press reports, that some kind of military action was imminent. The word was quickly passed on to Havana, which alerted Castro and his troops to the coming attack. 2 days before the invasion, Cuban exiles flying U.S. planes bombed major air bases on the island. CIA officials told leaders of the brigade that nearly all of Castro's air force had been destroyed in the raid, and that simply was not true. Yet in spite of the intelligence failures, the obsolete ships and equipment, and all the other blunders in planning and strategy, the invaders did manage to get ashore, and during the first day of combat, they had the upper hand. Fighting more with bravery than experience, the brigade inflicted heavy casualties on Castro's troops. But that early success could not be sustained. The invaders were vastly outnumbered on the ground, and under steady attack from the Cuban Air Force, they were told had been destroyed. As their plight became desperate, brigade leaders began looking for the U.S. support they'd been promised. What they most urgently needed was air cover to ward off Castro's planes. But Kennedy stuck to his pledge that there would be no direct U.S. intervention. For the invaders on the beach, that presidential decision sealed their doom. 3 days after the landing at the Bay of Pigs, it was all over. The 1,000 or so members of the brigade who survived Castro's guns were subjected to the ordeal of a noisy public trial. And for the next 20 months, they would languish in Castro's prisons. Military disaster soon became political disaster as deniability crumbled and the heat turned on President Kennedy.
In view of the fact we're taking a propaganda lambasting around the world, why is it not useful, sir, for us to explore with you the real facts behind this or our motivations?
Well, I think in answer to your question that we have to make a judgment as to how much we can usefully say that would aid the interest of the United States. One of the problems of a free society, problem not met by a dictatorship, is this problem of information. A good deal has been printed in the paper. I wouldn't be surprised if those of you who are members of the press will be receiving a lot of background briefings in the next day or two by interested people or interested agencies. There's an old saying that victory has 100 fathers and defeat is an orphan. And I wouldn't be surprised if information is poured into you in regard to all the recent activities.
He knew that when the day of reckoning came, few, if any, of his advisors would be willing to share paternal responsibility for what happened at the Bay of Pigs.
The president took the responsibility for the operation. There were mistakes that were made, including the fact that there wasn't sufficient air cover for the beaches.
There is no question about the involvement of the CIA. If you talk to any of the leaders...
Reaction from the world press was not long in coming.
To have tried and succeeded would have been bad enough, but to have tried and failed is almost unforgivable. That's what many Frenchmen are saying.
A Senate committee this week figured the invasion cost at $45 million for the 1,500-man force. An administration group thinks the Central Intelligence Agency ignored Marine Corps doctrine on amphibious operations. Marine Commandant General David Shoup was never even consulted. The beaches were not prepared by air or artillery bombardment. Those able to move beyond the beaches were trapped in swamp or high growth, which was burned off, while Castro militiamen waited and watched for prisoners.
More than a year later, the brigade members taken prisoner by Castro at the Bay of Pigs were ransomed for large shipments of medical supplies and hundreds of U.S. tractors. They were cheered by Florida's Cuban community and inspired by the fighting words of John Kennedy.
Your conduct and valor are proof that although Castro and his fellow dictators may rule nations, they do not rule people. That they may imprison bodies, but they do not imprison spirits. I can assure you that this flag will be returned to this brigade in a free Havana.
But years later, the brigade leader, Pepe San Ramon, still spoke with bitterness about the way he and his men felt they had been betrayed.
I was ready to grab a rifle and fight the United States. It was a bad time for me. It was a bad time for every member of the brigade. Very bad. Our hopes were crushed. For me, the government of the United States was the utmost of everything. Bigger than my father, than my mother, than God. And to me, it was so low a blow. To bring you in here with so many plans and so many hopes for your country. And they knew before they said us, in my mind, that they were not going to go ahead with it.
The Bay of Pigs invasion did exactly the opposite of what was intended. Castro was not ousted, he was strengthened. The Marxist state of Cuba, 90 miles from Florida, would survive and in fact outlive the Soviet Union. But one immediate result was to inflame the tensions between Moscow and Washington. In the months that followed the Bay of Pigs ordeal, Kennedy and Khrushchev would test each other's will in Vienna, in Berlin, and on other Cold War fronts, not the least of which was Vietnam. In time, this steady escalation in rhetoric and military posturing would lead to another far more critical confrontation in Cuba, an East-West showdown that would bring the world to the brink of nuclear war. Tuesday, October 16th, 1962. President Kennedy is shown these aerial photos of the Cuban landscape. To an untrained eye, they reveal no secrets, just stretches of harmless topography. But intelligence experts know better. Robert McNamara, the Secretary of Defense.
What the photographs showed were something on the order, as I remember, of 20 to 30 intermediate range launchers, which could be targeted with nuclear warheads against the East Coast cities of the United States.
Thus, the start of 13 days of crisis that bring the two superpowers to the edge of World War III, the closest the world has ever come to nuclear war. The Cuban Missile Crisis began that October day against a background of steadily increasing Cold War tensions. Yet the installation of nuclear-tipped missiles aimed at American cities caught the Kennedy administration by surprise.
It was an unbelievable threat to us. I never conceived of the Soviets taking such action.
The Soviet leaders' move to install those missiles in the Western Hemisphere came after a series of foreign policy debacles for Kennedy. After the Bay of Pigs came the Vienna summit. Khrushchev, because of the disaster at the Bay of Pigs, was convinced that Kennedy was weak, indecisive, that he could bully the young president into submission on a number of key issues. And Kennedy was, in fact, badly shaken by that meeting. He came away with the conviction that Khrushchev was determined to test him. And the first test came in the summer of 1961. Khrushchev was turning up the heat to force the Allies out of West Berlin.
I hear it said that West Berlin is militarily untenable. And so was Bastogne, and so in fact was Stalingrad. Any dangerous spot is tenable if men, brave men, will make it so. We cannot and will not permit the communists to drive us out of Berlin, either gradually or by force.
In August, Khrushchev backed away. Instead, he ordered the building of a wall to seal off the people of East Berlin from any contact with the West. And that Berlin Wall became the symbol of the East-West confrontation for decades to come. While the eyes of the world were nervously focused on Berlin, trouble in Southeast Asia loomed. Kennedy ordered a sharp increase in the U.S. military commitment to South Vietnam to prop up the government of Ngo Dinh Diem against a force of communist insurgents. But Berlin was the prize that Khrushchev had his eye on. And though he worried about U.S. missiles based near the Russian border in Turkey, he was looking for a way to force the Americans into a move that would give the Soviets an excuse to seize West Berlin. For his part in Havana, Castro feared another U.S. invasion was coming.
Only an alternative was left for them: direct invasion against Cuba. And that danger, in our opinion, existed in a real manner. And this was behind the decision to set the strategic missiles in Cuba.
So finally, as the summer of 1962 was ending, Khrushchev's brazen move to install nuclear weapons on America's doorstep brought the Cold War to a boil. The first reports were sketchy from anti-Castro Cubans that Russian ships had carried intermediate-range missiles to Cuba. Administration officials were skeptical. They assumed any missiles in Cuba were defensive weapons, surface-to-air missiles, weapons that would pose no threat to the U.S. mainland. Nonetheless, Kennedy ordered reconnaissance flights, and the U-2s over Cuba brought back evidence that confirmed the administration's worst fears. The launching sites were for offensive missiles that could fire nuclear warheads at American cities as far away as Montana. The administration was stunned.
They had stated publicly there were no warheads there, no weapons there. They would not put them there, and yet they had.
Tuesday, October 16th, 1962, day one of the 13 days of the Cuban Missile Crisis. The president is shown the photographs.
The moment he learned the launchers were in Cuba, he took action to ensure that his associates, and he as well, had ample time to thoroughly consider the degree to which this was a risk to U.S. security, and if it were a risk, the alternative ways in which we should respond.
Kennedy immediately forms a select group of 15 advisors to help him decide how to respond. For days, they are the only Americans who know how grave the situation is. Many of those high-level meetings were recorded on audio tape.
They shoot those missiles, we would generally get their warning. And we are to put on paper the alternative plans and the probable or possible consequences. The announcement is there. It's quite obvious to them that we're going to probably do something about it.
And then we're going to have to think Russian ships, and we're going to have to think Russian submarines.
The first order of business, to lay out the options, which range from a diplomatic protest to a full-scale invasion of Cuba.
If we permitted them to deceive us in this case, would not our allies think, unless we forced the missiles out, that we would permit the Soviets to deceive us in other cases? Would there not be a shift in the political balance, if you will, between East and West? There was a very great danger there would be. It was absolutely essential, therefore, that those weapons be removed from Cuba, but that we do it without starting a war. That was the President's objective.
Day 2, Wednesday, October 17th. Intense discussions. The consensus clearly moves toward airstrikes to destroy the missile sites. But Robert Kennedy has deep reservations. In a private note to his brother, the Attorney General says, "I now know how Tojo felt when he was planning Pearl Harbor."
During that entire week, we met almost constantly, almost literally, if not 24 hours a day, certainly 18 hours a day, arguing about, thrashing out an analysis of the risks to our security and the ways in which we should respond to it.
Day 3, Thursday, October 18th. McNamara comes up with an alternative, a naval blockade of Cuba. Soviet ships bound for Cuba would be stopped and searched. Any with offensive weapons would not be permitted to pass. McNamara's proposal carries a lot of weight because in making it, he breaks ranks with his own top deputies, the Pentagon generals who want a bomb. So they decide on a blockade, but they choose another word.
We called it a quarantine, by the way, because blockade connotes an act of war. We meant the quarantine to be conveying a message to the Soviets. We didn't want war, but we wanted those missiles out.
What if the Soviet ships choose to challenge the blockade?
I was very concerned at the time, not because I could predict the road to the disaster, but because I couldn't predict a road that would avoid disaster with any feeling of confidence.
Day 4, Friday, October 19th. The veil of secrecy is beginning to wear thin. The Washington press corps has picked up enough signals to know that some kind of trouble is brewing. Too many high-ranking officials have been spending too much time away from their normal duties. In an effort to keep up the business-as-usual look, Kennedy flies to Chicago to begin a weekend of public appearances. But the next morning, because of the mounting crisis, he calls the rest of the trip off. The cover story for his sudden return to Washington is that he isn't feeling well, and to lend credibility to the story, he even wears a hat. One of the few times he ever did that in public.
It's been suggested that national security affairs were possibly one of the reasons for the president returning. Is there any truth in this?
The president returned because of his cold and because of the advice of his doctor.
Kennedy decides he cannot wait any longer. He approves the quarantine. Days 5 and 6, Saturday and Sunday, October 20th and 21st. Navy and Air Force units are put on full alert. Allied leaders in foreign capitals are briefed. Congress is in recess, but Senate and House leaders are brought back to Washington.
Could this mean war, Senator?
It could. The secret phase of the crisis is over. Kennedy is now ready to break the news to an unsuspecting public. Day 7, Monday, October 22nd. John Kennedy's address is the most somber speech by an American president since Franklin Roosevelt summoned the nation to war after Pearl Harbor.
A strict quarantine on all offensive military equipment under shipment to Cuba is being initiated. All ships of any kind bound for Cuba, from whatever nation or port, will, if found to contain cargoes of offensive weapons, be turned back. It shall be the policy of this nation to regard any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States, requiring a full retaliatory response upon the Soviet Union.
Cuba reacted to the president's speech tonight by ordering all its armed forces on an immediate alert.
The U.S. is prepared to sink Soviet ships. The U.S. must assume it will face losses. U.S. sea and air patrols immediately will hail, stop, and search all ships bound for Cuba.
We are now in the most dangerous situation since the end of World War II. The next 48 hours will be decisive.
Day 8, Tuesday, October 23rd. For the first 13 hours after the speech, there is no response of any kind from Moscow. And when they finally do react, it is with a perfunctory note to the American ambassador accusing the United States of piracy. It contains no threat of military action, no warning that Soviet ships intend to run the blockade. Kennedy shortens the line of interception for the quarantine from 800 miles to 500 miles. The idea is to give Khrushchev more time to decide what to do.
The world was given at least a 15-hour moratorium tonight. President Kennedy, at 7 o'clock Eastern Daylight Time, signed the formal proclamation of a quarantine on Cuba, but it doesn't go into effect until 10 a.m. tomorrow morning Eastern Daylight Time. Until then, we won't fire even if Soviet freighters slip through our picket line of ships surrounding Cuba. But tomorrow morning, the story will change, and some 25 Soviet vessels are believed approaching our American warships.
Are there nuclear warheads on the island? In view of the fact that we know and have identified substantial numbers of missiles that can only operate with nuclear warheads, it's fair to assume such warheads are on the island.
We have since learned there were something on the order of 160 nuclear warheads on the island, including 80 tactical nuclear warheads to be used against an invasion fleet and against land forces on the island. We didn't know that at the time.
Key West, just 90 miles from Castro's Cuba, has been the focus of military buildup during the day.
Well, the American blockade against our country is an act of war. It is the use of force by a great power against the independence of our home. It is a criminal act.
The days were tense because we were monitoring the movement of every Soviet ship leaving Soviet ports on their way to the Western Hemisphere. We'd taken certain of the Strategic Air Command bombers and tankers off their missions and put them on photographic missions to photograph the movement of these Soviet ships.
The Executive Committee met with the President first this morning. CIA Chief McCone, one of the most important men of the group. Today, some of its members were in twice, the second time to approve the proclamation, which the President signed at 7:05 this evening. A few strokes of the pen which formalized an abrupt and irreversible change in American policy.
Worried, alarmed, afraid perhaps even, the American public nonetheless appeared determined and resolved, and its attitude was summed up by Adlai Stevenson at the UN.
We hope that Chairman Khrushchev has not made a miscalculation, that he is not mistaken forbearance for weakness. We cannot believe that he has deluded himself into supposing that though we have power, we lack nerve, that though we have weapons, we are without the will to use them. We still hope, we still pray that the worst may be avoided, that the Soviet leadership will call an end to this ominous adventure.
This is the point at which we are concerned that there might be shooting among the ships at sea.
Day 9, Wednesday, October 24th.
We have said if there's rocket fire from Cuba, we will retaliate, and there goes the whole ball game.
And the most tense moment, I'd say, was the moment when a Soviet ship approached the quarantine line and didn't stop. And the issue is, what should we do? The Navy, quite properly, felt that they'd been carrying out what they call blockades since John Paul Jones, and they felt they should fire on it. We were determined they wouldn't, at least not in the first instance, and we let it pass through. The second ship came up and stopped, and then we were informed from our aircraft reconnaissance that all the Soviet ships moving toward the island of Cuba had stopped in the sea and turned and went back. And that was a very, very tense and crucial moment.
At the White House, Secretary of State Dean Rusk ventures this thought. We're eyeball to eyeball, he says, and I think the other fellow just blinked. But the crisis is far from over. Russian technicians are still working around the clock at the Cuban missile sites to install the weapons and equip them with nuclear warheads. Latest intelligence reports say some of them could be ready to fire on the U.S. in a matter of days. So Kennedy steps up the pressure. He sends word through Soviet Ambassador Anatoly Dobrynin that a decision to remove the missiles has to be made by the weekend, or else.
The majority of the president's military and civilian advisors were recommending to him that unless Khrushchev quickly, such as on Sunday, announced withdrawal, we should immediately attack. And we had plans to do so. The first day's airstrike would have included 1,000 attack sorties against targets in Cuba, and almost surely would have been followed by a sea and land invasion.
Day 10, Thursday, October 25th, the United Nations.
Let me ask you one simple question. Do you, Ambassador Zorin, deny that the USSR has placed and is placing medium and intermediate range missiles and sights in Cuba? Yes or no? Don't wait for the translation, yes or no?
Я не нахожусь.
I am not in an American courtroom, sir, and therefore I do not wish to answer a question that is put to me in the fashion in which a prosecutor does. In due course, sir, you will have your reply.
You can answer yes or no. You have denied that they exist. I want to know if I've understood you correctly. I should like to say, sir,
Sir, would you please continue your statement? You will have your answer in due course.
I'm prepared to wait for my answer until hell freezes over, if that's your decision. And I'm also prepared to present the evidence in this room.
Day 11, Friday, October 26th. Using ABC News diplomatic correspondent, later UN Ambassador John Scally as a go-between, an official in the Soviet embassy outlines a possible agreement. Removal of the missiles in exchange for an American promise not to invade Cuba. The message is relayed to Kennedy, and Scally is immediately told to say that such a proposal would be given serious consideration. A few hours later, Kennedy receives a long, rambling letter from Khrushchev. He writes with anguish about the terrible destruction nuclear war would bring to both the United States and the Soviet Union.
It was the very firm, very hard opinion of my father that it is impossible to begin this war. It is not his decision like politician, it was the decision of his heart.
The Premier's letter seems to echo the proposal to Scally, removal of the missiles in return for a pledge not to invade Cuba. Day 12, Saturday, October 27th. The two superpowers move to the edge of war. The day begins with a second letter from Khrushchev that is more formal in tone and harsher in content. This time, the condition for removing the missiles from Cuba is the withdrawal of NATO missiles from Turkey. But Kennedy does not want to be seen bargaining away weapons important to an ally in exchange for the security of the United States. Elsewhere, events are starting to slide out of control. First comes a report that an American U-2 plane has veered off course into Russian airspace and is now missing over Siberia. Then comes news that another U-2 plane has been shot down over Cuba by a surface-to-air missile.
You have some commander acting on his own and firing a surface-to-air missile, or some navigational system malfunctioning and a U-2 flies out over the Soviet Union, or a U.S. naval destroyer deciding that they'll teach those Ruskies a thing or two by dropping depth charges on the submarines. All these things combined could very well have convinced one side or the other that nuclear war was about to begin.
Kennedy decides to act. At the urging of his brother and other key advisors, he decides to ignore Khrushchev's second letter with its condition about removing the missiles in Turkey, and responds instead to the earlier one with its more vague, more conciliatory proposal. The White House dispatches the letter to Khrushchev that evening and announces it has accepted Soviet terms for an agreement. It is now up to Khrushchev. If he refuses to go along with Kennedy's proposal, Kennedy would be under enormous pressure to take military action.
It was a beautiful Saturday night. I was leaving the President's Oval Office about 7 o'clock to go back to my office. And as I walked out the door, I thought I might never live to see another Saturday night.
By late Saturday, the Pentagon is pushing hard for an airstrike on Cuba on Monday, to be followed by an invasion.
We would have been met with nuclear warheads. Our force was not equipped with them. We would have had to respond with aircraft carrying nuclear warheads from the U.S. We would surely have done so. Cuba would have been utterly destroyed. Our forces would have been decimated by nuclear warheads. Where would it have ended? Surely some of the warheads on Cuba that were capable of striking U.S. cities would have been launched. And surely we would have responded, and very likely against targets in the Soviet Union. It would have been a disaster.
But it never comes to that. Day 13, Sunday, October 27th. At 9 a.m. Washington time, Radio Moscow announces Khrushchev's decision to accept Kennedy's terms. In accordance with the U.S. pledge not to invade Cuba, the announcement says, the offensive missiles in Cuba will be dismantled and returned to the Soviet Union.
The following is the text of President Kennedy's statement of noon. I welcome Chairman Khrushchev's statesmanlike decision to stop building bases in Cuba, dismantling offensive weapons, returning them to the Soviet Union under UN verification. This is an important and constructive contribution to peace.
The flavor of capitulation is all over the Soviet capital tonight. You get the feeling that the Soviet government has backed down all the way.
If we had had to act on the Wednesday in the first 24 hours, I don't think probably we would have chosen as prudently as we finally did, a quarantine against the use of offensive weapons. In addition, that had much more power than we first thought it did, because I think the Soviet Union was very reluctant to have us stop ships which carried with them a good deal of their highly secret and sensitive material. So it's very difficult to always make judgments here about what the effect will be of our decisions on other countries. In this case, it seemed to me that we did pick the right one. In Cuba of 1961, we picked the wrong one.
We congratulate ourselves about the management of the missile crisis, and we congratulate the Soviets about Khrushchev's statesmanship in pulling out those missiles. But the fact is, those two superpowers brought this world to the brink of destruction. That's nothing to be proud of.
In conventional war, one makes mistakes, and those mistakes are costly. They lead to the death of hundreds or thousands, sometimes tens of thousands. But they haven't and don't lead to the destruction of nations. We try to learn from our mistakes. We say we'll not make the same mistake twice. There is no learning process with respect to mistakes relating to the application of nuclear force. And I think that's the conclusion one comes to. An indefinite combination of human fallibility and nuclear force is bound to lead to destruction of nations.
I speak of peace because of the new face of war.
In June of 1963, Kennedy unveiled a new direction in foreign policy in a commencement address at American University. He called on the American people to re-examine their hardline attitude toward the Soviet Union.
For in the final analysis, our most basic common link is that we all inhabit this small planet. We all breathe the same air. We all cherish our children's futures, and we are all mortal.
He ended the speech with the announcement that British and American officials would soon be going to Moscow to negotiate a nuclear test ban treaty. Both Kennedy and Khrushchev regarded the test ban as the first in a series of steps aimed at eventual nuclear disarmament. But the fragile détente of 1963 did not last long. 3 months after the treaty was signed, Kennedy was assassinated. And 1 year later, Khrushchev was ousted from power. In the decades since, historians have pondered the question about what might have happened if Kennedy had lived and Khrushchev had remained in power. Would they have been able to build on the promise of the test ban treaty? Would there have been other arms agreements leading to an enduring détente and an early end to the Cold War? What we do know is that instead, after Kennedy and Khrushchev, the new Soviet leaders, stung by humiliation in Cuba, chose to strengthen their nuclear arsenals. And the United States responded with a huge buildup of its own. The long and dangerous arms race continued and did not end until the collapse of the Soviet Union in the 80s. And throughout those years, there was always the fear, lurking in the background, that yet another Cold War crisis like the one in Cuba in 1962 could again push the world to the brink of nuclear war. I'm Mike Wallace, and this is the 20th century.